Have you ever been in a room or a crowd, an event where someone says something so bold, so unexpected, so powerful and memorable that you can just completely feel the atmosphere change? That kind of moment where everybody's paying attention to what's going on, but then conversation stops, every head turns, and you know you're going to remember these words for the rest of your life. That's exactly what happens in this scene in Jesus's public campaign. Man, it's getting exciting. What's up, everybody? I'm Tyson Putthoff. This is scene 11 of the Jesus X30 challenge. And we're following my books, Jesus, The Strategic Life and Mission of the Messiah and His Movement. All 3 volumes are published now in print and ebook. Grab your copies or check them out online through your library apps. Get a hold of them. We're in scene 11, and like I say, man, it's getting good. Up to now, Jesus has been healing, casting out demons, challenging the elite, and forming his core leadership team. But here he steps into the role of revolutionary leader in the most public way yet. He's laying out his platform for what the kingdom of God, the empire of God, is going to look like. And this isn't this vague spiritual pep talk. It's a full-blown constitution for a new kind of society. He delivers it twice. We know it once as the Sermon on the Mount, and we know it another time as the Sermon on the Plain. Once he delivers it on a mountainside, as Matthew tells us in Matthew 5 to 7, and once on a level plain, as Luke tells us in Luke 6. One moment is elevated and it sort of evokes Moses on Sinai. The other is more grounded. It's eye to eye. Jesus is meeting the crowd down on their level. And both settings are deliberate, both carry layers of meaning, and both are explosive. It's the spring of 28 AD. The weather's dry now. The roads are open. Conditions are perfect for large outdoor gatherings like this. It's near the Sea of Galilee, where the land rises and falls in sort of this patchwork of hills and flat stretches. On the higher slopes, you can see for miles over the lake, across the valleys, even to the far side of the Jordan on a clear day. The acoustics are remarkable. A single voice can carry so that groups and crowds can actually hear. It's sort of like a natural amphitheater on the hillside. Matthew 5 to 7 places Jesus on the mountain. That image immediately pulls on Israel's collective memory. Mount Sinai, where Moses received the law. Mount Carmel, where Elijah called Israel back to God. Mount Zion, the seat of God's reign in prophetic visions. To stand on a mountain and deliver a foundational word was to step into the lineage of Israel's great covenant moments. And remember, this is over a year after Jesus has gone public. So he's already building a movement. And now he steps onto this mountain like he's going to deliver this momentous word from God. Luke's account, which I think happens within the few weeks after Jesus gives this same speech on the mountain in Matthew's gospel. In Luke's account, Luke has Jesus descending to a level place. Okay, Luke 6. Here, the symbolism is different. Instead of standing above like a lawgiver, Jesus is standing shoulder to shoulder with the people, level with the dusty sandals, the calloused hands, the lines of worry on the faces of those who are following him and hoping that he's the one who's going to deliver them. This is not a contradiction. It's not Luke and Matthew talking about the same exact event, but describing it differently so that we find a contradiction and we can throw all the gospels out as ahistorical. This is 2 different events in 2 different settings where Jesus more or less gives the same speech, but he leaves some things out and adds some things in each one. It's a balance. And in one telling, he speaks with the authority of heaven, and in the other with the solidarity of the earth. And the crowd is anything but homogenous. There are fishermen who've left their nets, farmers who've left their fields, day laborers who live one missed payment away from disaster. There are mothers carrying children, old men leaning on staves, tax collectors curious enough to listen, and religious skeptics who've heard the rumors. And woven through all of them is this tension of life under Roman occupation. Roman taxes are very heavy at this point. Local elites, religious, political, social, they profit from this system, but they're still under the charge of the Roman Empire. Land is lost to debt. Honor is hard to keep. People are hungry, not just for bread, but for this hope that the world could be different. And Jesus comes along and he begins to speak. And he doesn't open with laws or decrees or even commands. He begins with blessings, but not the kind anyone expects. We call these the Beatitudes, and we spiritualize these and we make these into this sweet little soft moment in which Jesus is just telling us, hey, buck up, kiddo, things are going to be okay. That is not what's going on here. And I spent 3 podcast episodes just dealing with these Beatitudes. And man, it was the most challenging study that I've ever done. They'll wreck you. In Matthew's version, Matthew records Jesus as saying, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who are persecuted. Matthew 5:3-10. Luke's version, which again, Jesus gives this speech in a separate campaign moment, maybe within the next couple of weeks after he gives the campaign speech on the Mount. So in Luke's version, the words are a lot sharper and he pairs the blessings with warnings. Okay, so pay close attention to whom Jesus favors, whom Jesus declares as blessed by God and favored by God, because yes, God has favorites, and whom Jesus considers cursed and in danger of God's curse. Okay? In Luke 6, blessed are you who are poor. Blessed are you who hunger now. Blessed are you who weep now. And he follows these blessings by, woe to you who are rich. Woe to you who are well fed now. Woe to you who laugh now. Woe to you when everyone speaks well of you. Luke 6:20-26. In the world of Rome, blessed was the word for the well-born, the wealthy, the honored, those with the power to shape society. In the world of temple aristocracy, blessed was reserved for those who were ritually pure, who were socially acceptable, who were economically secure, and visibly favored by God. And Jesus flips it here. And he doesn't even lead in with a, hey, glad to have you here. Hey, welcome to my speech. It's good to see each of you here today. He just launches right into this. And he flips everything they expect to hear on its head. Here, the blessed are the ones Rome overlooks and Jerusalem sidelines. The cursed, at least in Luke's telling, are the ones the world calls fortunate. This is a direct challenge to the values of both empire and temple. Then comes the next wave. Jesus begins a series of reframing statements. You remember this? In Matthew 5, 6, and 7, Jesus repeats this line, this refrain, and he says, you have heard that it was said, but I say to you. So at first glance, we might read this as Jesus offering commentary on religious rules, right? What we call spiritual or church laws today, or bylaws, and claiming authority over the scribes and Pharisees. But in the first century world, as we've talked, the Torah wasn't a separate religious code or theological code or church code tucked away in the synagogue. It was Israel's national law. Now, there were tricky aspects to it because they didn't ultimately have the jurisdiction in certain situations. They had to rely on the Roman authorities to do that. So there were some issues with it, but it was still the framework for how society functioned in every area of justice, economics, family life, neighbor relations, how to treat people in certain situations. So when Jesus addresses commands about murder and adultery and divorce and oaths, revenge, love of enemies, he's not just tweaking personal piety. Okay, this has nothing to do with just this privatized, personalized, spiritualized spiritual life. Jesus is speaking to the actual laws that govern daily life. They govern business dealings and court cases. They govern property disputes and community relationships. These are the statutes by which a people live together. And Jesus doesn't just restate them, he deepens them. You've heard that it was said, do not murder. But I say, don't even have anger toward a brother or a sister. So Jesus is saying, don't just avoid criminal bloodshed. He's addressing the inner hostility that corrodes a community before a crime is ever committed. I think this one's especially relevant for our heated day and age. You've heard that it is said, love your neighbor. But I say, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Just to clarify, Jesus is not saying pray that your enemies are put to death, okay? And Jesus is not saying show them tough love, right? Punch them around a little so that they come to their senses. No. Jesus is saying love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you the way I love you, even though you persecute me. That's not just fulfilling a minimal obligation to those within your circle, within your family, within your church group, within your political circle. That's expanding the very definition of neighbor beyond the limits of tribal and political and national and ethnic and social and economic boundaries. What Jesus is doing here is laying out the legal and ethical pattern for life in God's kingdom. A people whose laws are authorized by God's character, not by the shifting priorities of emperors or governors or nations or elites. Those are not abstract moral ideals. These are the DNA of Jesus' kingdom. They describe how power will operate in his kingdom, how love will act and look in his kingdom, how justice will function among the citizens of his new kingdom. And he's saying, I don't care what nation you live in. I don't care what national allegiances you have. If you're one of mine, this is how you operate. I don't care if your political leaders or your religious leaders say one thing. If you belong to my nation, my empire, my kingdom, this is how you'll act. These are the laws of the kingdom of God. Jesus is actually putting forth a constitution for his kingdom. In Matthew 5, 6, and 7, and in Luke 6, he's saying this is how our new society, the society that I'm establishing on earth as it is in heaven, that's how it's going to work. And if you're on board with me, this is how you'll behave. And at one point, he calls his followers the salt of the earth and the light of the world. So in our world, those phrases get tossed around as motivational slogans, right? As spiritual lights in the world, as salt of the earth. We're supposed to go out and be different. But in the first century, they carried an edge. Salt preserves what would otherwise rot, so it's a stabilizing, purifying force in a corrupt environment. Light exposes what hides in darkness. It disrupts the status quo by making hidden things visible. To tell this mixed crowd that they're the salt and the light is to tell them that they are the active agents of transformation in God's new order. Not the priests, not the wealthy patrons, not the imperial officials, them. And we usually, as I mentioned a moment ago, call this the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain. And because of that title, we tend to approach it like a theological thing or a religious talk, like a sermon, something we take as a private reflection or personal inspiration. We privatize it. But in the first century context, in Jesus's world, this is anything but a quiet devotional. This is not a sermon. This is a political campaign speech. What Jesus delivers in these moments functions more like the preamble to a constitution, the public declaration of how his new kingdom will operate in contrast to Caesar's empire, or in contrast to any other earthly power structure, including our own. And Jesus is basically saying, hey, Caesar's laws may say this. The Levitical law may say this, but I say this. And if you're a part of my kingdom, if you're one of mine, this is how you'll behave. And this is the framework for life in the empire of God. He is laying out the core values, the expectations for citizenship, and the guiding principles for justice and mercy and community, and even vengeance. In Rome's empire, Caesar set the tone, right? He set the laws and taxes and military power and definitions of honor, who counted as blessed. In God's empire, in Jesus' kingdom, Jesus sets the tone. And it's a deliberate reversal of the order of the world, both in Jesus' day and in ours. So when we read these blessings, these warnings, and these redefinitions of love and justice, we're not just reading inspirational sayings for personal improvement that we're supposed to read, feel good about, hang on our wall with some calligraphy. We're listening to the governing charter of a movement. It reframes what it means to be blessed, flips the entire moral hierarchy on its head, rewrites the terms of neighbor love, and hands the work of transformation, changing the world rather than abandoning it, instead of cursing it and saying it's going to hell anyway. It's handing that work of transformation and preservation and recreation to the people least likely to be invited into power. If you were sitting in that crowd, especially if you were among the rich, the well-fed, the respected, the honorable, this speech would have been deeply unsettling. Okay? If you were poor, if you were hungry, if you were shut out of the inner circles, it would have been electrifying. Either way, it made things clear to everyone that things were not going to stay the same as they've always been. And from that moment, there is no going back. Jesus has drawn the line in the sand. We can't mistake this moment for a spontaneous sermon. Jesus isn't just speaking because the mood felt right, he's seizing an opportunity. By gathering people outdoors, whether on the mountainside in Matthew's account or on the level plain in Luke's, he bypasses this sort of chokehold of the official systems. There's no presiding official to cut him off, as there would be in a synagogue and as happened in Luke 4. There's no legal expert ready to derail him with questions about precedent and debates about interpretations. There's nothing between him and the people but open air. And that is deliberate. That is strategy. A synagogue gathering might hold a few dozen people at most. On the hillside, you could fit hundreds or thousands even. And the message can spill far beyond the first few rows of listeners. And unlike the temple courts or the city squares, the hills and plains of the Galilee aren't heavily patrolled by soldiers or even overseen by the gatekeepers. Not at this point. And what's more, Jesus chooses topics that aren't safe abstractions. He teaches about anger, revenge, greed, anxiety, wealth, prayer, mercy, hypocrisy, justice. Every one of these touches daily life. And everyone exposes how the present systems, whether those are ancient systems or contemporary systems in our own world, fall short of God's design. This is a manifesto, not a pep talk. This is a public campaign, not a private devotion. In 1934, the Nazi regime was really tightening its control over Germany. Not just politically, but spiritually. The German Christian movement sought to merge the church with Nazi ideology, and it sought to replace the gospel with loyalty to Hitler and this radically pure state. So, in response, a gathering of pastors and theologians met in the city of Barmen. They knew the risks. Public opposition to the regime could mean losing their pulpits, could mean imprisonment, could mean death. But they also knew silence would mean surrender. What they produced came to be known as the Barmen Declaration. It wasn't a long document, but it was a clear one. In 6 short articles, they declared that the church's only head is Jesus Christ, that no other authority, whether that was a premier, a politician, a president, prime minister, no other human authority, political, ideological, racial, could replace Jesus, and that the church must reject any teaching that contradicts Jesus's word. It was, in effect, a manifesto. The Barmen signers weren't just offering private encouragement to one another, were they? They were stating publicly and without apology the non-negotiable foundation for a different kind of community. And like Jesus's audience, not everyone welcomed it. Many pastors actually refused to sign this. Some saw it as too radical. Others feared the consequences. But for those who heard it and believed it, the atmosphere changed for them. There was no going back to a comfortable compromise. The so-called Sermon on the Mount and the so-called Sermon on the Plain were Jesus's Barmen Declaration moments. This is where he drew the contours of the kingdom in a way that could not be mistaken for the kingdoms of the world. The blessings and woes were the introduction. They reframed who God's favor rests upon. The "you have heard it said, but I say to you" section was the body. It redefined the moral and social norms of God's people. The salt and light image was the commissioning. It told ordinary people that they were now the agents of the new order. It wasn't neutral, it wasn't vague, and it wasn't just spiritual. This was political in the deepest and truest sense, not about campaigning for office, but about reordering society itself. And here's an uncomfortable truth. If Jesus gave this speech today about blessing the poor, about loving our enemies, sadly, a lot of churchgoers would walk out. A lot of religious leaders would feel their authority threatened. A lot of well-connected people would feel the sting of those woes. But the poor, the hungry, the exhausted, they'd lean in, they'd nod, and they'd feel seen. And that's the challenge for us, not just to read these words as ancient poetry, not just to hang them on our wall in some pretty artwork, but to ask where we stand in the crowd. Are we the ones being comforted or the ones being confronted? Are we cheering because the kingdom is coming closer to our lives, or shifting uncomfortably because it might cost us something? And beyond that, are we living this manifesto? Are we actually embodying the mercy, the peacemaking, the justice that Jesus describes here? Are we the salt in a culture obsessed with wealth and power and political allegiance? Are we the light in a shadowed world? Jesus didn't give the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain so we could frame them on our walls. He gave them so we could live them in our neighborhoods, our workplaces, in the way we vote, in the way we hold our leaders accountable, in our relationships. He declared a revolution and then invited us to join it, not as spectators, but as citizens of his kingdom, his empire, his new society. And Jesus also didn't intend this public open air campaign speech to be taken only as something to be applied privately or inwardly. In much of American Christianity, we do a good job of preaching powerful message from Scripture, but then we quietly shrink them down to personal sins, to trying to be a little more moral inside, to clean up my thought life, to not hold a grudge. But Jesus's point here isn't about following him purely in the private spaces of my heart. He's giving instructions for how his people are to live out the kingdom in public life, how he intends us to love God and love our neighbors in a tangible, sacrificial way every day, whether they are like us or not, whether we agree with them or not. And I want to speak especially to those of you who preach and teach. If our messages make following Jesus mainly about avoiding inward failings, right? Like bad thoughts or private moral lapses, like thinking the wrong way, feeling the wrong way, then we're only telling half the story. Jesus makes it clear that discipleship means living for the good of others, laying down our own interests, and practicing the kind of love that changes relationships, workplaces, communities, systems, and nations. Not just me cleaning up some bad habits in my heart. At the beginning, I asked if you've ever been in a moment where someone said something that just completely changed the atmosphere. That's what happened in the Galilee in the spring of 28 AD. Once on a mountain, once on a plain, where Jesus declared the foundation of a new society, one built not on fear or hierarchy, but on justice and mercy and radical love. He named the blessed and warned the comfortable. He handed the work of transformation to people the world thought powerless. And he never once, notice, never once in his constitution, in fact, never once in all of the Gospels did Jesus ever say that it's the duty of his followers to take up the sword and go and fight for him. Never. He handed the work of transformation to people the world thought powerless. And from that moment forward, there was no going back. Not for them, not for Jesus, and certainly not for those of us who follow him. Lekulmad, go and learn. Come back for scene 12 of the JesusX30 challenge.